Hello, my name is Adrian Anderson. I've been working with Oracle CPQ for around 10 years now, and I currently work at Oracle supporting the product. This content is separate from my work with Oracle, and it's just a means to get information out there for free. So what we'll be covering in this video is going to be how to bulk upload assets into CPQ. And this is going to be important if you are implementing asset-based ordering or you're implementing CPQ for the first time and you already have assets running previously and you still want to manage those assets in CPQ. More or less, how do you take assets from over here outside of CPQ to get them inside of CPQ so you can then later modify them, manually renew them, or terminate them as I demonstrated in previous videos. So that's what we're going to cover. Let's get to it. Okay, so again, bulk loading or bulk load assets into CPQ. I want to go through the steps. There's really three or four steps to do this. And I figure, I don't know, the best way to show you is just to write it down. And then after this, we'll actually go look in some applications. So first is you need to create and save a transaction. You can do this in one call. There's an API for this. And essentially you're going to be passing the information that's relevant to create this transaction. Now, because we're talking about assets that are already existing, this transaction will need to be dated in the past, and it will need to be at least the date that the asset was requested. Ideally, probably the date the asset is started. All right. Of course, it needs to be against the relevant customer. You just can't put, an asset against any old body. We need to know who it's against. And then other considerations as fit. And I put this in here because I imagine there's going to be more things that a company may want to put on a transaction that really its only purpose is to act as a vehicle to get an asset into the asset repository. But if there are things that you need to put on this asset, like install date or fulfillment date or any other auxiliary things like that, you have to figure that out. But in this video, we're just talking about how to do the fundamental task. All right. So once you have created and saved your transaction, you then need to bulk add items to the transaction. Again, there's an API for this. This is going to be the most effort. The most effort. I want to emphasize that. This is going to be the biggest hurdle to cross because you have to convert your source data into the proper request format for this API. Okay? So just know that if you're going to be implementing this yourself or paying someone to do it, this is where most of your money likely will go. Most of your time is likely going to go here. Okay. Once you get your items, which will essentially are your assets to the transaction, you can save the transaction via REST API, and then you can trigger the action to commit those assets to the asset repository, which is usually the update asset timer. So if you've seen any of my past videos about ABO, I've highlighted this action a lot. This is the one you get out of the box. This is the one that commits the asset repository or the configurations, the line items on the transaction to the asset repository. And you can trigger this via REST API. So this is what we're going to do. I have all this set up, and essentially I'm going to show you how it's done. Okay, so we're in Postman now, and essentially all of the work we're going to be doing will be in Postman. So I should mention that to do this sort of work, you need to at least be an intermediate level using Postman. Okay, you need to know how to use pre-script, pre-request scripts, test scripts, um, variables, all that kind of stuff. So we're in Postman now, and I have a folder here called bulk asset upload flow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over these four APIs for each really iteration of an asset or at least a transaction that I need to create. So just like we talked about before, create transaction, bulk add to transaction, save the transaction, update asset. So to do this loop that I'm describing, we're going to use a runner, which I can start by either right-clicking on the folder and going to run folder, or I can come to the bottom right here at the bottom of the right of the screen, click runner, and then I can drag my folder over into this pane, and then we see these 4 requests here, okay? Now, to get the data that I need, I'll come over here to the right and I'll come to select file. And this is the file that I want to use, this item bulk upload JSON. So I open this, and then it detects the data file type for me, and I can preview it. You'll see here that I have 4 columns: iteration, default request date, contract periods, and items. And this items is a big JSON object. So let's look at this file in VS Code because it is JSON. And this is it here. So I have, I think, maybe 20 iterations here. Each of them has a relatively different request date and contract period. But for the sake of simplicity, all of them have the same configuration here. Now, this is what I was saying or meaning earlier by this is the hard part, because you have to get all of your data from the source. You have to transform it into this format, because this is how the API, the bulk at the transaction API, accepts things. So I'm going to spend more time talking about this in a little bit, but let's start from the top and we can talk about this create transaction. So let's open it here so we can take a look at it. And before we look at this, because there's some things I need to explain here, like these variables, let's look at the documentation for this. So I'm in my Commerce REST APIs at help.bigmachines.com. Anybody can get this. I encourage you to go look at it. And we're using this, create a transaction. We are not using create a transaction with parts, because this is only going to allow us to do simple parts, or in other words, parts that are not in a hierarchical order, not in the parent-child relationship, just simple standalone parts. But for ABO and SBO, asset-based ordering, subscription-based ordering, we need a prerequisite is bond mapping. We need that parent-child relationship. So we have to use create a transaction. So the endpoint is quite simple. And the response or the request body is a JSON object. Okay. So let's look at our body for the request. It needs to be an object. There needs to be a documents object underneath it. And I'm passing only the transaction attributes that I need here. Okay. So all of my transactions are going to have the same name. They're all going to be the same type of transaction. The contract periods and the default request date we're going to get from the data upload, which I'll talk about how we do that later. And I'm just doing all of my uploads for one customer. And that's what I think you should do. I think you should define what the critical mass is for having a bulk upload file. For example, say if a customer has 12 assets with you, give them their own file. It's not really worth trying to do everything in one go. Do it customer by customer, unless there's a few customers that have 1 or 2 assets, and then you're okay with using variables here. But that's your decision. So I'm getting the contracted periods and the default request date from that upload file. So if I go back, you'll notice that I have these keys here, even for items, and then the value is what we want. So I'm stating the key here as a variable, and I'm going to use a pre-request script to populate these undefined variables. So if I come to the pre-request script, and you can read these descriptions if you want to pause the screen. But essentially what I'm doing is Postman, over the iteration data, I'm going to get the default request date. I'm going to get the contract periods. I'm going to assign those values to constant or attributes here. For the default request date, I need to stringify it because it needs to be a string. And then I'm going to set those attribute values to the variables that I've described here. So it's a 3-hop thing. We're getting the values from the import file, we're setting them to another value that is such as a placeholder. And then from this placeholder, we're going to plug the value into the body, the request body. So 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to mention this now, but when you create a new transaction, it's going to respond with a JSON object of that transaction, and it's going to include the BS ID or buy side ID. I need to get this ID and store it in a collection variable because I need to reference that later, which takes us right into the next API in the string, which is this bulk add to transaction. And like I said, the first thing one of the main things I need to get or know is this buy side ID. So this variable is taking the information from what I'm setting here in the collection variable. And I'm getting the information in this collection variable from the response of the create transaction. So again, a 3-hop kind of thing. The response comes, we're going to get the BSID, we're going to store the BSID in the collection variable, and then we're going to reference the BSID in another API's request body from the collection variable. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, again, this is already set. Now, for items, okay, I'm doing the same thing that I did for the default request state and the contracted periods here. So in my pre-request script, it's the same kind of thing. Get items from the iteration data, put in the placeholder called items, stringify items, and then from the string of items, we're going to place it, we're going to set it in the variable items. So maybe it's a little hard to follow because they're all relatively named the same thing. But again, it's this 3-hop thing. Get the information from the file, store it in a placeholder, use the information in the placeholder to inform the payload. Okay. I am doing a relatively simple way of doing this. If I come back to the file that I'm using and I expand the items, this is how the payload needs to be for the bulk add to transaction. And this is a good time to look at the documentation for it. So we'll come over here, come to bulk items, and I'm going to read this overview because I think it's very important. Oracle CPQ exposes configuration objects and configuration data through REST APIs and RESTful standards. This REST API is used to add several model configurations to a transaction. This is important. I'll read it again. This API is used to add several, or just one, model configurations to a transaction. With appropriate HTTP basic authentication, administrators can make use of these services. So what this is saying, to make it clear, is we can use this API to add model configurations to the transaction without having to go through an actual configuration instance. I think of it as a shortcut through config. All right. And if we look at the documentation here, and I can encourage you to come read it, here is the payload, the sample payload it gives. BSID, the document ID, and maybe it's important that I show you where this is because it's not so straightforward unless it's stated up here. Yeah, so it's already stated up here. So you can find that. And again, it's product family, product line, product model, then this big object config data. And the config data is, and I'm going to show you over here, it's better to look at it in this view because it's formatted. The config data is really just the attribute and the value for the attribute. So in runtime, as a user, you log in or you come into a configuration instance, and then you can select things, right? This way, we're doing the same thing, but we're just doing it through an API. Because these values here, these keys, these are the variable names of configuration attributes. So, for example, if I take internet speed, come over to my attribute list for my configuration. Right, this is the product family. This is the product line. I'm going to Control F and paste. Here's internet speed. And I can even come in And I can see here are the options. And then if I come back over, I can see here's the value or the attribute to the variable, and here's the display value. And that's consistent with what we see here. Okay. So long story short, this bulk upload to transaction allows you to create a configuration or a model configuration by passing in the values for configurable attributes. Okay. So again, what I'm doing here is I'm just taking items from here. So I'm taking this whole thing this in this object I'm taking and I'm just plugging it in here, just lifting and shifting. You could get more fancy and do something like I have here in my detailed bulk asset upload, where I have this item array or config, this items array already filled out, and I'm using undefined variables for all of the values for the keys. I think this is a bit harder to do, but either way, it's going to be hard to transform your data from the source to this susceptible payload. Okay. So again, just to emphasize it, doing this, that transformation is going to be where most of your time and effort will be. Okay. Enough of that. After that, after we run this API and it's successful, we're going to save the transaction. Again, we're going to reference the buy side ID. That's quite simple. And then we're going to trigger the update asset action. Now, I don't know if you know this, but most commerce actions, at least the modify commerce actions, you can trigger them from trigger them API just by using actions / then the action variable name. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. You won't find this in documentation, but you can do it. And that is essentially what we are doing. Just looping over those, running these four APIs in a loop, and we're taking the data we need either from a collection variable or the data iteration variable, or I should call it a local variable, local to the request. So before I run this, before we run this to upload 20 assets, or at least create 20 transactions, in reality, we're creating more assets, but that's details right now. Let's first look at our transaction manager. We see that there's nothing here. And then also let's run the get all assets to show you that there's nothing here. I don't want you to think that I'm cheating you. So nothing here. Okay. So we'll go to our runner. I'm going to persist response for a session because I want to see if there's any errors. I don't think there will be. And I'm going to run this. It's going to take a while, so I'll maybe speed up the video. But let's do it. Okay. So we finished all 20 of our iterations. No errors, which is all good. So we're done. That's all you need to do. It took us about 2 minutes to upload 20 assets. Imagine how long that would have took us if we did all that by hand. And then let's just look at our results in the transaction manager. Everything is in here. Everything is fulfilled. Let's just open a random one. Okay, we'll see the request data that we want. This is 12 periods. Let's open another one. Let's see. Okay, interesting. Something I'm saying that I wasn't seeing before is that my requested periods are not what we put in the payload. So So I did a little bit of debugging or exploration after I finished the video. So this is me after the video has been edited. But I want to actually correct this problem. So there's no confusion when you're watching this. I want to be as helpful as possible. So I'm back in Postman and I'm looking at the pre-request script for my create transaction. And you notice that I'm using this variable contract periods to set the value for the CPQ attribute requested. Sorry, actually, it was contracted period that was here. So it was like this. Okay. And I came over back to CPQ. I inspected the page, just click this inspect. If you don't know how to do that, now you do. And I'm going to look at I don't know what this tool is called. I like to call it the Explorer. And I'm seeing that this is the attribute that I want to check. I forgot that I actually made this requested periods. So this is the variable name that I want to set the value for the requested periods to, because this is going to ultimately determine the term for my assets. And I've talked about this in later videos. So I have updated this like so. And I've also updated the pre-request script like so. And then I have also updated the file. I've changed request date from contracted periods. So all I would say is you want to be careful about, you really want to make sure you're using correct attributes. So it's easy to make the mistake. I did it, been doing this for a while. So just want to be honest and show that that was the error I made and then how I corrected it. We put in the payload. So let's take a look at the payload. It's not a big issue for us right now. Because again, our goal was to get just the assets in the asset repository. Now let's just take a look at one. We want to look at a create transaction. Oops. We want to look at the request. And it came in here. So I will check this later. I won't let it interrupt the video. And then let's make sure our assets are actually in the asset repository. So we'll run to get our assets. And yes, everything is in there. So that's effectively how you do a bulk asset upload. So just to wrap up, to do it, there's 4 APIs you need to run. Create transaction, bulk upload items to transaction, save the transaction, and then update asset action. Most of your time is going to be spent getting the data from your source file or your source data into the correct or proper payload for the bulk add the transaction. And then from there, it's a matter of making sure that your integration flow or runner works. Came into a little hiccup with the contract periods not coming in as we want, but that's okay. That is a relatively small issue that we can solve. And I may come back or write something up to walk you through how I did that. So I hope this was helpful. If it was, please like, comment, subscribe, share it. Any questions you have, please put them in the comments. I check them regularly and I'm more than happy to respond. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.